Hi, everybody. So, actually, what I'm, yeah, no worries. What I'm not sure I fully fit in this panel because what I'm talking about today is partially about the digital world, but perhaps most relevantly about very physical kinds of interactions, including some physical violence against the journalists. But it does overlap a little bit with the previous presentation of Anna Litze. What I will talk about is an ongoing research that I've been doing with colleagues from Università Rovere Virgili, which has to do with the relationship between journalists and far-right populism in Italy and Spain. Before starting, two considerations. One is about the term far-right. As you can see, I put it in parentheses, because when we talk about Italy and Spain, we cannot talk just about far-right populism. These are two countries where there are relevant political forces that are or have been considered populist, but that are not far right. So, for example, Podemos, as it was in Spain, and so far left populism would have been defined, and the Five-Star Movement in Italy, which is populism of what side it's still rather unclear. And the second one is on the term populism. I know it is a very contested concept. We are aware of that, and actually the research started with a question about how journalists were defining how they understand what they mean when they talk about populism, and actually if they use it in their profession. And then we had a second part, which is the one I'm presenting, that is more related to the impact that far-right populism is having on the profession. So we interviewed journalists that cover specifically far-right populism from a critical stance. Because again, Italy and Spain, not all the journalists or all the journalistic media are the same. There are some leaning towards the right, towards the left, some are populist, some are not populist. So we have a specific population of journalists. Now, briefly about what we know about this relationship. We know that it is a very complicated relationship between journalists and populism, and especially right now, far-right populism. So the media, the news media, journalists in particular, are considered by far-right populist forces usually as a detached elite, a corrupt elite, enemies of the people. So in this typical juxtaposition of the good people and the evil elites that belongs to populism. There is distrust in the news media. They are called in Germany in particular the lying press, Lügenpresse, if I remember well. Sorry for my German. There's a lot of online harassment, but there is also a lot of verbal and physical violence towards journalists. In general, there is a discourse of far-right populism attitude toward journalism, contributing to a certain erosion of press freedom. There's also some research, not much as far as I know, but some research on reactions of journalists. For instance, Ayala Paniewski has noticed how Israeli journalists that were attacked by Benjamin Netanyahu and his party and his government tended to use a strategic bias, meaning voluntarily biasing themselves in favor of the far right to avoid being accused of bias on the other side. While in the German context, for example, it has been noticed that professionalism has been used as a response to far-right populism. So as populists accuse them of not being professional, they respond by trying to be more professional, whatever that means. Briefly about our methodology, we simply used, this is the second part of our research, so we used semi-structured interviews with journalists who covered far-right populist forces. I say it again, from a critical stance or from news media or TV channels, radio channels that are not considered close to far-right populism. Several of our interviewees have been personally attacked by some of these forces or work for news outlets or TV channels that are not liked by these forces. So at the moment we have interviewed 10 Italian and 10 Spanish journalists. As I was saying, we asked the first part of the interview about how they understand the concept of populism, the word, how they use the word itself in some cases, and if they find it useful. But what I'm talking about today is what impact they perceive populism had on their profession, both at the individual level of the single journalist and in general for journalism at large. We have anonymized all interviews, which have been audio recorded and then transcribed, and they lasted between 30 and actually 50 minutes. I don't know why there's 48. Okay, so I will structure it on three main topics using extracts from the interviews. The first one is disintermediation, but not just disintermediation, but the fact that journalists perceive difficulties in getting access to these politicians due to a certain kind of hostility, top-down hostility, and obstacles that are created by these politicians. So, for example, we have here a long extract of an investigative journalist that explains that there is, and this overlaps with what you were saying earlier, that there is a fundamental problem in the way political parties in Italy relate to newspapers. That is, newspapers are no longer essential for them to tell their story. Now, he says newspapers, but he works for an online outlet, newspaper, so we're not just talking about print media here. So he says Italian political parties have become very good at using social media, and as an investigative journalist, he knows that if he has a piece coming out on something inappropriate or potentially criminal by one of these politicians, he will have struggles in getting a response from this person or party or group or whatever. And he attributes this to the fact that they prefer to communicate on social media and that they create obstacles that are represented by press offices that are very effective and very good at doing their job, and that make his job extremely complicated. Other journalists in Italy, they talk about attempts to control interviews and questions in general. So, for example, the majority, apparently several journalists told us that the majority of politicians, not just populists in this case, they want to be able to approve the interview before it's published. They tend to organize, rather than full press conferences, these press points, these punti stampa, which do not allow neither the presence of a lot of journalists, neither the time to ask enough questions. And then even cases in which they want to be asked questions without the journalist being there. And here I put an example. Is something that actually happened. So this is President of the Senate, Ignazio La Russa, and he self-interviewed, is written on this newspaper himself, meaning that he had to respond to an investigative TV program, and he asked them to send questions to him. Then he had his spokesperson ask him questions in video, responded to the question, send it to the TV program, asking that all the full video was used in the TV program, which they did, but they disclosed it. If we think about approval of interviews, this is never disclosed, for example, in Italian newspapers, in Italian outlets at least. Passing to Spain, there have been cases, more than once I put here examples to substantiate the extracts from the interviews of Vox, so far-right populist party in Spain, vetoing access to journalists to their events, electoral events, to their headquarters, and so on. So El País, for example, was vetoed by Vox, and two of our interviewees talk about how it happened to them or to their outlet that they were vetoed by Vox. Then we pass to more direct cases of violence. Here we have a first example of a Spanish. I used only a Spanish example because this was somehow more common in Spain than in Italy. It might be a matter of who we interviewed, but a Spanish female journalist who claims that in the headquarters of a populist far-right party, she was not attacked or anything, but she had a feeling that this was possible at any time, like that they were really controlling her and what she was doing there, and that at any moment she could be kicked out of the place. But more substantially, we have another journalist, these are not the only two examples, but I use these ones today, of a journalist who explains that he that covering these forces has caused to him enormous economic and personal prejudice to the point that he lives in hiding, and he highlights literally in hiding, and that he had to change address following threats and an assault that he suffered while covering these forces, a series of problems that have affected my personal and financial life, and this of the financial aspect is quite relevant. Then he goes on and explains that he's not the only one, and that in these days they are talking about protests that there were in Madrid for the new left-wing government, for the amnesty for the Catalan independentists. They were covering these demonstrations in Madrid. They had a lot of problems, meaning direct threats of physical assault, being forced to delete photos from the camera, and just being expelled from the demonstration. And finally, he highlights, and again, others highlight this in both countries, actually. Oh, yes, thank you. When you're assigned a subject like this, you think twice about going there because you know that you're risking equipment, not just your safety, but equipment. And many of our interviewees were freelancers or young journalists in precarious positions. And he, for example, said, if I lose my equipment, I'm ruined, I'm done. Because, yeah, they have insurances and everything, but I mean, you know, the degree to which they self-censorship to some extent is risked when you have such an environment. Finally, third element of this thing, it's not just populism. All of them, nearly all of them, talk about the fact that this just adds up to an internal crisis of journalism that is made of several aspects. For example, we have this Italian TV journalist who explains that yes, there are populists, but on the other hand, us as TV journalists are forced to do pieces that do not exceed 3 minutes because authors believe that people can only follow up to 3 minutes. Not only that, we have to make it as simple as possible. We have to add a music that helps them to feel the correct feeling that want to be elicited. And she makes several examples, and so she concludes, well, I don't know if we could survive if we don't do that, but on the other hand, we take, you know, I feel like taking some of the responsibility. And she closes with, I think we've all kind of stopped trying for the most part, which is not encouraging. Other journalists, Spanish and Italian, they talk about the fact that journalism is going through a phase of weakness. It's an economic system that doesn't work. It doesn't stand anymore. It is in a state of abandon, totally precarious, a very precarious sector where immediacies become more and more important, and content has to be as easy as possible. So there is no possibility to go in depth into the topics. So as I'm, yes, I'll finish. This is the last one. So we're talking about a multifactorial crisis that depends partially on populism, in this case far-right populism, but on all. Yeah, in Italy, for example, they attribute some of the things to the Five-Star Movement as well. But on the other hand, it depends on an internal crisis of journalism, and it depends on digital affordances to some extent as well. But this intermediation is not just seen by them as a consequence of the existence and spread of social media, but it is something that is voluntarily exacerbated by the practices that politicians are using to avoid the intermediation of journalists. And several of them, not all of them, some of them, they also don't have, two of them, Italians, they don't feel this problem. They think they have good access to politicians and they don't see any particular problem. Others say it's not just populist, this is spreading, and now they're all kind of doing the same thing. On the other hand, there is a hostility that is also diverse. No, so top-down hostility from the political leadership, but also bottom-up hostility, ostracism, verbal violence, physical violence, online harassment, and threats of surveillance. I added this because one of the Spanish journalists, she explains that she has been receiving for years anonymous communications that they are keeping her under surveillance, and she doesn't know what's happening exactly, but she explains that it is not particularly nice, and that many journalists just don't want to cover these forces because of that. And then the impact that is exacerbated by an internal crisis for journalism that is made of a reputational crisis, an economic crisis of the sector, the precariousness of individual journalists, economic risks, for example, lawsuits or loss of equipment, as we've seen, and a general or quite general perception that journalism is losing its quality. And we've seen it, for example, in how they talk about how TV, not entertainment, but journalism is made. And I'm finished. Thank you.